I'll begin this afternoon's session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I will be hosting today's session. Today is Thursday, November 7th, 2024, and this is the first session in the e-lecture series entitled Inspiring Community Action, Connection and Stewardship. How can civic involvement support Canadian urban forests? The series is brought to you by Tree Canada. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate with Adrina Bardakjian and the team at Tree Canada to host these webinars. Today's webinar is titled How Treehuggers Save the Urban Forest. Mississauga, Canada case study on local level engagement in urban forest governance. A special reminder that the ISA certified arborists are eligible to receive one continuing education unit for this webinar. Please email electures@cififc.org with your full name and ISA certified ID in order to obtain the ISA continuing education unit. Once we verify your attendance, we'll send your information to ISA for them to process. Today, we have Adrina Bardakjian, Director of Research and Engagement from Tree Canada. With that, I will now pass it over to Adrina to introduce today's e-lecture speaker.
Thanks, Sharon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome on behalf of Tree Canada, and thank you for joining us today. And thanks again, Sharon and the CIF for hosting this event. I'm thrilled to introduce our first speaker in this series, Dr. Sadia, who works with ACER, the Association for Canadian Educational Resources. Sadia is an urban forest professional with 25 years as a practitioner, researcher, and environmental educator. Her areas of research and practice include urban forest ecology, invasive species monitoring and control, urban forest governance, neighborhood mapping, quantitative and qualitative data analysis, and community engagement. Sadia has diverse experiences in the municipal, federal, and nonprofit sectors, where she has carried out her passion for protecting and conserving the urban forest and educating the public using citizen science and outdoor education approaches. In 2013, I had the opportunity to work with Sadia to co-host the International Conference on Urban Forests and Political Ecologies, celebrating transdisciplinarity, and subsequently we co-edited the text Urban Forest, Trees, and Green Spaces. And for as long as I've known her, which has been over 20 years now, she has worked relentlessly towards equitable practices and governance in urban forestry and continues to make strides in justice and community stewardship. So Sadia, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Adrina. I'm really glad to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this talk, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series as well. The lineup looks really interesting. It's giving me a chance today to share what I learned from my research on community engagement and urban forest governance. I worked in urban forestry for several years after completing my master's and was motivated to pursue research due to three key factors. One was that trees and forests, though being valued, were not necessarily being protected very well. The public and the terrestrial managers wanted to have a healthy forest. They wanted trees to do well, and yet there was a disconnect on the ground. The second was that when we looked at urban forest cover, and I learned this from my master's when I was studying invasive woody species in Mississauga, that there were less than 6% of natural cover, and in 2000, less than 2% of that natural cover was forest cover, and even less than 1% was tableland forest. And this was constantly at risk. So my question was, how do we resolve that as a society? We want to have a healthy urban forest, yet decisions in urban areas continue to be made that resulted in the removal or damage of what little we had left. In my educated opinion, I felt that every bush and plant was locally rare. The final factor was during the spongy moth breakout from 2005 to 2007, I was working at the city of Mississauga, and I saw how when residents pushed for action to save their oaks from being decimated, we were able to mobilize at all the different levels within the city, with our partners at the regional level, at the provincial level, and even federal partners. And they took action to save their oaks for Mississauga and neighboring areas. Were also included in some of our roundtables from being decimated. We mobilized to create a program aimed to protect the oaks and other favorable species of spongy moth. It's its new name. It was called gypsy moth at that time. And these residents were the urban version of tree huggers. So briefly, I'll be giving some background information, throwing out some definitions to keep us all on the same page, go into my status of urban forests, and then I'll discuss the role of knowledge and the strategies used by organized residents, which are the outcomes from my research. And then to conclude, I'll make recommendations to answer specifically how we can further support the E-Series theme of civic involvement in urban forests. And then finally, there will be room for questions and discussion. Next. So tree huggers have been, I'm sorry, I was supposed to, Sharon's helping me with moving the slides over. So we're on slide 3 right now. Okay, so tree huggers have been associated with highly controversial situations where people have tied themselves to trees to protect them from being cut down. The term started in India with the Chipko movement in 1730, which began when 294 men and 69 women belonging to the Vaishnava branch of Hinduism were killed by foresters who were harvesting trees to build a palace. Chipko means clinging or hugging. Fast forward 267 years to 1997, when Julia Butterfly Hill lived for 2 years in a tree in efforts to save Luna, a 1,000-year-old redwood, and her forest habitat in Humboldt County, California. In between and since, there have been many dedicated tree huggers like Brazilian Chico Mendes, who've fought with their lives, who have made an impact with the practice of saving trees. Oftentimes, tree huggers is said in a derogatory term, identifying the individuals passionate about trees as extremist environmentalists. Their actions are seen as bizarre and consuming. From my experiences, almost 30 years of them in forestry, virtually all people, in secret or sometimes overtly, will call themselves tree huggers. Next, please. So we have tree huggers from youth to adults and even non-human actors. This is because we understand that trees in our urban forest benefit us. As you can see in this next slide, tree hugging actually has become a trend. And we also have had in Canada, at that time in, I believe, in Montreal, Adrina did a world record or a Guinness record of holding a tree for over 8 hours, I believe. You can correct me, Adrina, later. This because we understand that trees in our urban forests benefit us. And because of this, we engage to plant, save, or advocate for trees, which are prominent fixtures in our environment and good indicators of what's happening with the climate change and the impacts of development. The community engage in urban forest governance, and it is through action and networking. So one theory, according to actor network theory, humans and other actors, the next slide please, influence the shape of our environment. Not surprisingly, we have agency along with tools to shape how our environment looks from places we visit and inhabit, like our parks, yards, and balconies, and even in our homes with green roofs and with green walls. The structure of urban environments is not a product of a linear process attributable to only historical, social, or physical processes. The neighborhood urban forest structure is influenced by the community, the interplay of politics, economics, culture, and existing biophysical structure. In essence, it's political ecology, the science that looks at these. And in turn, these factors shape citizens' roles in urban forest advocacy. This theory can also explain how tree huggers emerge. They build their agency based on knowledge and try to influence how the outcomes look for their targeted trees. Next, please. An example of this is the way the spongy moth epidemic impacts society and urban forests. We see that the actors are human and non-human, as they have different levels of agency. We have insects, we have trees, and we also have the humans that are observing the impacts of spongy moth eating the leaves of oak trees. If it wasn't for an invasive insect, Limantria dispar, whose new common name is spongy moth, a whole program would not have begun to save the trees that it would impact. Having a network of people who uphold policies that are accessed by human actors directly to result in the protection of the forest and interests of the human actors and the trees. In effect, this theory is one way to understand urban forest governance, and we can use the language it applies in urban geography concepts. Next slide, please. So some definitions. The way I look at community engagement, defined by Beckley et al., includes the processes where individuals to stakeholder groups through various means have the potential to influence decision-making or forest management issues. Community engagement can be characterized as both formal and informal, tied to common interests and or geography, and have the potential to build connections with local government. Next slide, please. And what is urban forest governance? Basically urban forests, and then governance, which we all have a good understanding of. And this is where the structures, the rules, the partnerships, and processes that exist in cities or urban areas, they impact the decisions about how urban forests, trees, and woodlands, whether they are natural or cultivated, emerge. Next slide. So political ecology is to look at the role of community engagement in urban forest governance. I use that lens as it allowed me to approach this research in the context of the many intersecting disciplines. One of the key attractants of urban forestry and forestry in general for me was that it utilized all the different life sciences, it utilized spatial understanding, it utilized a physical practice of protecting trees, conserving trees, and it involved the community. And this was really interesting to me, that it has a multidisciplinary, which we now call a transdisciplinary approach, that if you're going to manage urban forests, it involves all facets of life and definitely governance. So my research questions and the methodology were inspired by that political ecology approach, and I used a very qualitative design to answer my questions. Next slide, please. Political ecology has 5 principles that shed light on the interactions between nature and humans, governance, and outcomes. And you can see how all the different disciplines can impact our study of urban forest governance. Political ecology focuses on those contentious issues between nature and human behaviors. And in my research, I looked at the differences in power, how they shape aspects of people's relationships with the urban forest, the distribution of urban forests, how it's not equitable, and also how participants in human affairs are not all humans. There are trees, insects, and they tend to have a certain level of agency as well, where we have bylaws that are centered around trees. So through human setup devices, trees have agency for their protection. And then, of course, we do the doing to make sure that they are protected. Next slide. So next, I'm going to talk about the status of urban forests. It's a continuously sad story of stress and pressure with increasing urbanization and development. It is incredible how resilient our urban forests are, despite all of this. And of course, it's incredible the work that people do to make sure that they maintain their resilience. Not only in public spaces, but private property is also at stake as homes are rebuilt and expanded. And 90% of our urban trees in Ontario are on urban private property. We are losing biodiversity, and we are facing increased threats from climate change impacts, such as disease, insects, and the climate impacting the abiotic features such as soil, reducing their minerals and their organic matter. On the positive side, advocacy is going along with the studies focused on understanding urban forest governance and importantly, monitoring urban forests along with the establishment of urban forest management strategic plans is growing. At the Canadian Urban Forest Governance, I was just happy to see that these efforts are growing in more municipalities than when I had done my research, and I had to pretty well count how many had urban forest management plans, and there wasn't that many at all. Next slide, please. The other issue that research shows is that there are disparities in the cities in the US and Canada. Cities have uneven urban forest distribution, and this is due to social justice issues related to policy power and access to decision-making. Despite our knowledge and assessments of these factors, it is an uphill battle that is being addressed at all levels. Again, at the Urban Forest Conference, we heard Dr. Lorian Nesbitt and Jed Daly. They spoke about their research on how they are doing the groundwork, respectively, to assess what's going on and to remedy these disparities. Next. And very quickly, for anyone wondering about my methodology, I usually show this. So it's different from a quantitative study. It was a qualitative study. I interviewed in depth with 9 organized resident community groups with several members in my interviews, one at a time. There were resident association executive members. I also interviewed councillors, and I interviewed staff members from the municipality and other terrestrial managers from conservation organizations and other groups. These interviews were transcribed. The data was coded. I did a lot of coding based on the literature review and also from findings from the interviews themselves. Next, please. Then I used an iterative process to recode, reanalyze, and produce categories of those relationships between knowledge and community engagement. And through this process is when it really hit me how transdisciplinary urban forest governance work is. Next slide. The resident association members came from a mix of RAs that varied by geography, age, socioeconomic demographics, and canopy cover densities. And to bring it all together, this diagram shows the framework that resulted afterwards. It was developed to encapsulate the key interactions of concepts and the literature, my literature analysis, such as capacity building, agency, empowerment, and adaptive management, as they intersected with my findings of the RA executive members' narratives. It showed how they were engaged in urban forest governance at the neighborhood level, especially there, even though there were people who were concerned about the city at large, most of their work was at that neighborhood level. This framework can also be applied to community groups and other environmental undertakings. I was able to speak to people who were wanting to manage water quality, and they said that that neighborhood level was really important. Next slide. So let's begin to specifically answer how tree huggers save the urban forest. First, they have knowledge. That was the biggest finding out of everything. They referred to knowledge in very different contexts, and I had to synthesize all of this. And this became my first chapter, which was published later on into a peer-reviewed journal, Urban Forestry and Urban Greening, with Dr. Smith, Mula, and Conway. And I would at this time like to also acknowledge their incredible input and help to get this information out to the community at large. Next, please. So knowledge we know the definition of, but I wanted to bring up the concept of critical conscious theory, something that elevates humanity, elevates us to a tree hugger, people who are willing to sacrifice their lives. The theory I found that helped me understand what it takes to make someone either protest from the local to even the national level. According to Paulo Freire, who developed this theory, knowledge increases critical conscious, which leads people to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against oppressive elements of reality. From my research analysis, I found that residents who were engaged did build this capacity. I also witnessed action through my interviewees as they described not only what they were doing, but also what their peers were doing and people that they looked up to, what they were doing to develop community engagement. And I also notice this when I'm working with students. I do these leadership trainings with ACER, the organization I work for. And with the students, we see them act immediately. With the community at large, they take a little more time processing how they're going to do something. And in my research and for my practice, which I've incorporated, 4 themes of knowledge emerge. Next slide, please. The first theme that emerged is people know what they want. I was incredibly pleased, actually, that they were focused on building their knowledge about urban forests. They wanted to know more about trees. They also, in their survey portion, when I asked them different kinds of things that we know in forestry are important, they also wanted to see more canopy cover or a healthier canopy cover in their neighborhoods. They also wanted to see more canopy cover in their city. They expressed concern about wildlife dependent on the habitat, and they also wanted to leave a legacy for the future. And interestingly, they wanted more knowledge. Next slide, please. So they had knowledge about urban forests. It was critical. And what they did know about trees was really important in how they acted. They needed to know what the ways trees grow. They wanted to learn more. They wanted to know how trees would survive with different best practices, with management approaches. They also wanted to make sure that whatever they did was environmentally feasible and sustainable. They were also concerned about the loss of certain ecosystem benefits, like noise retention or water uptake or soil erosion. So they were quite versed in the benefits of our urban forest. And knowing that potential loss is what led to action. When they described why they were doing something, they would say it's because we're going to lose this. And so they would relate it to what was going to happen physically to trees and the impacts they would have on those benefits that we enjoy. And this led definitely to action. And so knowledgeable tree huggers take action. Next slide, please. So this led to their roles. What kinds of action would they take? So for action to happen, the groups needed to know what the role of decision makers were first. Residents were happy to follow their chain of commands. They trusted that the system had a way for them to network. It had a way for them to voice their concerns. And it would have experts that they could ask their questions and get remedies to what was happening. And this came out in all the research participant narratives and counselors I interviewed. So not just the participants, but also the decision makers. There was a mutual understanding that knowing each other's roles was critical to effective communication and problem solving. And many of the counselors that I interviewed felt that they had a much easier flow of communication with those people who had already done their homework. Next slide, please. So the fourth theme of knowledge was the clarification of the resident association roles. They needed to know what their responsibilities were and clarifying what their groups were going to do in their networks with the municipality and other collaborators. They found that they were effective at advocating and mobilizing. They also created engagement opportunities through events and acted as a quasi-council when they were the go-between for the city, and even some of them sat on task forces. Some of the councillors told me that it's almost like this other level of governance that goes on outside of council time. So knowing the roles of the various RA executive members also helped define the tasks and responsibilities, of course, that were undertaken, as well as helping the decision makers recognize which individuals were able to represent their neighbors. And they were also understanding where their social capital lay, because these individuals would tell them who was knowledgeable and who was able to act. Next slide, please. Then finally, one more level of analysis, and I framed their knowledge themes within these roles. And after recording and further analysis, I produced 6 categories of the relationships between knowledge and community engagement. And these characterize knowing. Resident association executive members were able to contribute to the governing process by knowing the problems in their neighborhood, having an understanding as well as an emotional connection to the vulnerability of their neighborhood urban forest. They also demonstrated that they adapted strategies to impact decision making. A lot of them wanted to not look like they were practicing the NIMBY concept. They wanted to show that they were just and fair. They did not want to have their own groups curate what the forest was. They wanted to get representation by going door to door and making sure others in their community also had a voice. I found that both decision makers and resident associations also valued and possibly judged knowledge sources, demonstrating a meta understanding of self-awareness, of knowing, and the act of knowing. Next slide, please. From the analysis of my results, I was able to conclude that knowledge was critical to all the roles that RA executive members took on, and it motivated them to engage in and advocate for urban forest issues, such that their knowledge and subsequent concern about the health or welfare of the urban forest propelled them to advocate for the neighborhood's urban forest proper governance. This is in line with Frere's critical conscious theory that education leads to empowerment, and this knowledge and action is respected by decision makers. The fact that they would be invited to sit on technical advisory committees, or they created subgroups to deal with specific urban forest issues and also even other issues in their communities, points to this fact that they became respected individuals by increasing their knowledge. And thus, when we characterize tree huggers, we must realize that they have attained a level of critical conscience that does not allow them to be apathetic, and in fact makes them more involved in their communities. So next slide, please. With knowledge and advocacy, what do they impact? What do they do on the ground? I remember early in my thesis, Professor Kenny said, are we able to measure what they're doing, like maybe how many trees they save or how many acreages of land? And that is definitely a good question to do for another study, but I wasn't taking those measures. But I did get from my qualitative interviews the answers to the physical spaces that they did save. And they saved not only trees that they came across on their streets or in nearby parks by calling 311 or their counselors, and also dealing with, even at the not only do they deal with the local level governance, they also speak to their MPPs. They saved woodlands and marshlands. They established roles that were not arbitrary or only administrative. Their roles impacted the curation of the physical features of their neighborhood urban forest. They speak up about what tree choices they want. They speak up about invasive species as they learn about them. And they impacted management of trees and the urban forest, as well as development of parks and even private areas through their involvement in private tree bylaws. In Mississauga, the resident associations, through a network of community groups that included business improvement areas and other community groups like resident garden associations, they were involved in building a group called Miranet, and they were sitting at the table with the decision makers developing the private tree bylaws, and came out with a very strict group, one of the strictest in all of Southern Ontario. And they were using a myriad of methods to carve a space to voice their concerns or share ideas. So residents built relationships with city staff, councillors, conservation authorities, as I said before, and they sat in deputations, and they also engaged in partnerships. And then there are communications, such as newsletters, social media, and community events. These are the building blocks of the strategies employed by RAs to engage with local level governance. And in my research, I used a political ecology lens to understand this space, advocacy, and the action. Next slide. They did specific events, and these are the actions that they took: invasive species removal, adopt a tree, park cleanup, private property planting, public tree planting, and petitions. And when we look at these activities, we're like, okay, these are things that people come out to. They're probably ad hoc, but they are the gateway to get them to become engaged in a more long-term manner, such as stewardship, taking on a particular woodland. For example, there was a group called the Friends of the Cawthra Woods out in Mississauga. There's a community center called the Frank McKechnie Community Center, and there was a forest beside it, and there was a stewardship group set up in there, and as well as in Malton. These stewardship groups, unfortunately, not necessarily survive on the long term, but they do engage people for more than one event, and they engage them for maybe a few years and a couple of years. And when they achieve their goals, it might go down because they were trying to save a salamander. They were trying to get rid of invasive species. And so it does change, and the challenges in trying to maintain those groups and maintain those associations. The other thing that tree huggers do is they impact decision making, and these were all, as I've already referred to some of them, these were all of the other levels. As you can see, they transcend the local level after a certain while, and they impact provincial and federal decisions, especially when it comes to tree removals on in large areas or in large swaths. Next slide, please. And so you can see on that slide all the different levels of engagement. And the next slide, please. So what motivates people? In our discussion that I had with my interviewees, we discussed their motivations. And we cannot remove that phenomena of motivation and intention of that public or the community to engage. So after the theme of knowledge, my participants did speak mostly about their motivations. And it obviously stemmed from their understanding of what was going on. They were highly motivated in their need to make changes in their neighborhood urban forest. As I said, it's at that local level. The three typologies were place-based and at the community level, such as preserve the characteristic of their neighborhood or improve their neighborhood. Some were personal or grounded motivations of self-fulfillment or personal goal-oriented objectives. So they valued the environment and they valued action. Finally, there are those that are nature-based, which range from an emotional-based expression or passion for trees to a knowledge-based understanding that was a need for conservation. This is probably the one that feeds the typecast of tree huggers the most in the public sphere. Next slide, please. So after deriving the components that depicted the nature of RA resident association strategies, I found that there were internal and municipal-oriented factors that had two facets. So one was the way that they were structured. It is really important to understand that a structured resident association that has a constitution, that has a plan, a strategy plan, or a management plan, they are more likely to impact decision-making processes. They are more likely to be taken as serious organizations. I found that when they had also numbers and subcommittees that dealt with issues, they were taken definitely more seriously. And then there was the tactical. So they established internal tactics, which is related to their structure. So such as drawing attention to issues and communication strategies, to build neighborhood urban forest knowledge. They would hold events that were basic, like we saw on the last list, but then they would build upon these and add complexity to these events. You know, inviting individuals who were experts or creating a knowledge-based theme. There was one individual who actually discovered in the Gordon Woods Resident Association spongy moth when she traveled to the US, and she started to build, she went door to door, she built a strategy asking the municipality to help her with this on how to direct people to find spongy moth egg masses, how to eradicate them, and also how to report them to the municipality. So the complexity builds when they have a structure, when they have knowledge, and when they decide that they have internal tactics. So they have a plan of strategy. And they also used the existing processes. So there is the municipal structure and the municipal tactics. And this is part of that actor network theory. Understanding those networks and understanding how to capitalize on them made a much stronger resident association. So their internal tactics definitely, when they aligned with the municipal structure and municipal tactics, was even more powerful. And I was also very surprised to find that many of the councillors felt in line with what resident association groups were doing, even though they had controversies, even though they had, they butted heads, they would definitely respect each other. And when I was going through all this, there's definitely that power struggle. And I wanted to go through what they do. So the next slide, please. And use the quotes of my interviewees and what they said. So they fight, and they say that we had to fight quite hard for the city of Mississauga and local councillor to protect this particular forest. It was in the Lisgar, northwest of Mississauga. It was slated to become a soccer field, and there were other pieces of lands that were going to be sold off in the same neighborhood, and they said they fought hard for keeping things public, not selling them off to private lands, private owners, and sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. Councillors would say that we can't win all those battles even though we're on the same side as our constituents. We just don't always have the money. Next slide, please. Treehuggers persist. And they said, one of the ladies who was talking about how they even began their organization. They wanted to have a garden and it wasn't being done. So they thought, okay, we're going to do this by ourselves. And her quote was, the people were like, no, that's not going to happen. We need to come up with natural ways. They had their own internal discussion. So that's how this whole organization got started. They decided to organize. Then with the help of motivated counselors, they said we made it into an award-winning pond. They started with a pond. Then they added wildflowers, shrubs, and they started to grow trees. And she said, why don't we just do a tree planting and beautify it even up more? So this is how they get into their resident associations. And I'd like to make a note here that of all the groups that I interviewed, all 9 resident associations' reason for beginning was because of saving trees or a particular woodland. So they were organized and began as urban forest conservation groups. And that really always, every time I think about how that was for the 9, I'm hoping one day to look at the rest and see where they were. And then they go on moving on to other issues, like taxes, etc. Next slide, please. And tree huggers have clout. The interviewees expressed how they had to show power through their knowledge and also their organization capacity and their numbers. I was aware of the fact that I was representing 800 households that pay a lot of property tax, and most of the households contain smart, motivated people. So for them to go to City Hall and make their views heard and get some action, it would be difficult for council to ignore it. So I was representing a fairly high power, high influence people. So building their clout, or even having the clout to start with, depending on the neighborhood they're in, was really important to get heard. Next slide, please. And I found that those power struggles to get heard was real. These nuances are often forgotten when we address equity, race, and resilience. To build resilience, the public, especially the vulnerable, need to be empowered. And this empowerment can be attained through their own creation, learning, their knowledge building, and urban forest advocacy, and maybe from their own personal experiences and education. But it can also be built. Next slide, please. Equitable access to knowledge is part of obtaining urban forest equity and justice. That's how we can build it. I found that the balance of power was tempered by these characteristics, such as trees as actors, respecting process, structured RAs that I've said already. And councillors especially felt that when RAs were knowledgeable, the process of governance and aware of the issues, they had more of a team approach than an adversarial approach. Institutional-based considerations such as municipal official plans and provincial growth stipulations tended to hold more power over neighborhood urban forest issues. And those kinds of things relaying to your constituents that this is what I'm facing, help them together build a strategy to deal with these overlying issues. Next, please. So the balance of power is also community-led. And when we see action that is community-led, that includes and respects diverse voices, then we have a decentralized approach to neighborhood urban forest governance, and we do then truly have a democratic process at that local level, despite what broad provincial or federal, albeit they are good for the greater good of all, at the local level, you want processes, acts, policies to respect and to reflect the voices of your local demographics. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways. Collective knowledge and social capital are built by connecting communities to the urban forest. Definitely, right? Because that's why those resident associations started. That's why those tree hugger groups organized themselves. They were truly tree huggers. It increases the ability of people to participate with local governments and understand that they can influence the governance of their communities. Finally, social capital builds community resilience. It also helps build the physical urban forest, not only for humans, but for our pets, for the insects, for the wildlife. It helps us advocate for the conservation of the urban forest and the trees, but by the public understanding and demanding best practices and better policies. Next slide, please. So recommendations to meet the theme of the series for fostering engagement are sharing information about urban forests, creating connections through activities in the neighborhood urban forest, clarification and teaching about local bylaws, and demonstrating all those processes. They need to learn about how they can engage with decision makers. And they need to be recognized that they have roles and that they can work with those decision makers. The municipality can provide access to information regarding local history, abiotic and components and practices to integrate nature into everyday life. Next slide, please. And through specific activities, like the access to information, neighborhood level nature walks. Municipal staff can work with local not-for-profit groups. And also, it's a plug for what I do, and also creating workshops on urban forest governance, because urban forest governance isn't hard. It isn't complicated. It is something that when we look at how these resident association groups form, how community group forms, how community gardens even form, we know that people learn through that action and they build their skills by that engagement, by local level communication with each other, building their networks. And when we look at any kinds of governance systems that try to suppress people, we see that they actually try to shut those voices by first not letting people assemblage, right? They're not allowed to get together. And so getting people together in this urban forest in a natural, safe environment allows for the building of citizens that are truly much more critically conscious of what's going on. They're much more knowledgeable. They're able to impact the livelihoods of and even the nature of their environment and the sustainability for each other, for the greater good. And so I hope that we can have a good discussion. I'm ready for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sadia. That was a great presentation. Now let's move on to the questions. While we're waiting for participants to finish typing their questions, let's take a moment to fill out a post-webinar survey. Just one moment. I'll launch it now. Just a reminder that there are 2 questions. You may need to scroll down to see all the questions. It seems that we haven't received any questions so far, but there is a comment we have in the chat. The audience is saying the challenge for tree huggers in Edmonton is convincing decision makers, councillors to listen to us over the industry lobby and the private property rights voices. Private tree bylaws are easily dissed by administrators as expensive. They're not. Their value and cost savings and popularity and acceptance rates need more marketing.
If you'd like me to comment on that, I will.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. I can definitely understand that. And there are communities that are trying to grow their local level of community engagement with respect, of course, to urban forest issues. It takes time. We even when I was volunteering on our Ontario Urban Forest Council, there are municipalities that were looking at developing bylaws, and they need guidance. There need to be guides. And the Ontario Urban Forest Council actually, I think many years ago, a couple of decades ago, did build a guide to implementing bylaws for trees. And it takes finding green sparks, as Alice, my boss, says, in those organizations who will align with you and who will start to understand that you could start to build your communication and your discussion so that you can start sharing knowledge, like sharing a guide, for example, or sharing, look what this municipality has done. One of the things that we learned early in environmental sustainability and protection and conservation was that demos work incredibly. So when you're trying to get people to understand something new, showing them how it's working somewhere else is a great example for making change in the mindsets of people who are stubborn, or like you're saying, they're dissing, and they're coming up with these expensive things. This MirrorNet, they were all volunteers. They were the public that sat. They didn't get paid for it. They sat with city staff, and they brought in their perceptions. They also were persistent. Like I showed, you have to be persistent and build your knowledge and look at what kinds of legal tools already exist that your municipality or your province has to implement, or what their due fiduciary responsibilities are. And so you can also use the legal route, where you could say, hey, look, in this act that we say that we follow, thou shalt have regard for, this is kind of like the language that is in there, for the natural ecosystem, and they should implement policies and acts for it. And this is what we're suggesting. So you can do those kinds of things. It does take time. It does take building networks. And sometimes with Mississauga, for example, with the spongy moth issue, it takes a crisis, right? In certain municipalities like Burlington, they've stated that they're in a climate emergency, and that of their top 3 mitigating acts that they need to take on are planting more trees, right? So using what we do have is really important, and also speaking to these other communities that have achieved these bylaws or are working on them. I hope that helps, Raquel.
Thank you, Sadia. So we actually got a few questions in the Q&A. Let's go over them. So the first question is, what were some of the barriers these resident groups felt when engaging municipal constituents?
So one of the barriers was time. And those, I did have a list of known, in the existing literature, because as you know, bureaucracy and engagement is something that has been going on since humans have existed, I guess. And so over time, we do the public policy literature showed that definitely time, money, also spaces, like actual so the decision maker, so the city or the municipality, their structure for setting up opportunities. So in Mississauga, for example, if there's a development that's going to happen, then you will have a community consultation. If you're a municipality you don't have that space, then somehow it has to be created, right? And so the existence of those so the barrier or the challenge was that they weren't enough, right? So then these resident associations then had to create their own spaces for it. And so they would do it through their annual general meeting, or they would have special requests to consult and sit with their councillor or decision makers. Or they would ask that we want to speak to the region. So Mississauga is divided into different regions. And they have a person who's a director of this one area. So they would say, okay, we'd like to speak to that forester or that manager. And so they would, using the rights that we have, right, your constituency rights, they would then ask to create those. So that's how they got around the barriers and challenges. And over time, governance has grown. And so these kinds of opportunities are much more prevalent. So instead of just having, way back, there was the what was it called? UFMATAC. I used to actually sit on it way back. Mississauga Technical Forest Urban Forest Advisory Committee. There's also now a climate change advisory committee. There is a environmental advisory committee, and then there's so many more now. So establishing these structures actually reduces those barriers and challenges and these avenues to engage with the public. And then time, sorry, I'll just deal a little bit on time. So time, not only of your counselors and your representatives, also the time that individuals have. I noticed that in my profiles of my the interviewees and the constituents that were active, they were mature people who had some time, who had some extra, I guess either retired is one of them, but not all, right? And they were then able to engage much more when they had extra time, or they had children that are already grown up and they were able to devote some more time. So, and then that luxury is definitely important on the side of your resident associations and tree huggers. I mean, you're also having to willing to sacrifice, and some did sacrifice some of those issues, right? They bring their kids along, or make sure the events did involve kids, so that it was part of the whole community engaging, and they wanted to bring more youth in, so that it would become a family event. Okay,
thank you, Sadia. Moving on to the next question. What is different between community forest and urban forest?
Okay. So community forests, usually that term is used for communities that depend on forestry for their livelihoods. And when we look at the literature and the research, and even actually when I did my master's at the Faculty of Forestry, at that time it was called, at U of T, we went to visit community forests internationally as well. We went to visit them in Italy, Germany, and Switzerland. And some of these community forests are where the community is involved in the decision making of how harvest is going to happen, how they take out non-timber forest products, to such as wood itself, like actual like wood without harvesting the tree, as well as mushrooms and other sources that the forest provides. And that's what community forestry is. when we're talking about urban forestry, right, we also looked at urban forests. They are, generally speaking, in North America, when we talk about urban forests, we talk about the benefits to us that are not monetary, because they have rules about what you can take out of a forest. Not saying all that, there are examples in Europe, and I believe it's in Norway. There's urban forests that are community forests. So all those factors that I've just said are combined. So not only do they want the benefits, they're also getting some livelihood out of it. They're also harvesting as a community together. And there's some shared economic benefit from that forest. I hope that helps explain. There's some really good pieces of information, especially coming out from BC, where one of our professors has talks about community forestry in Canada. So if you want to email me, I can send you some of those articles.
Thank you, Sadia. Next question for you is, how do we build funds? As you say, money is issue. MGA has limits.
The environment, yes, the environmental non-government organizations. Definitely money is an issue. One of the growing benefits that we're seeing are that programs like the Billion Trees programs, other community engagement funds. Tree Canada has a lot of community funding as well now that they've been building upon. These kinds of funding, and also from corporate funders like Toronto Dominion Bank. TD has a Friends of the Environmental Fund, Arbor Day grants that are in the US. Those are increasing, and they're allowing for more projects to happen. So that's helping alleviate some of the load. It is an issue. For example, I remember sitting in a Healthy Cities visioning process in the city of Mississauga. I am from Mississauga. And in that, when they were talking about how do we make, and I was sitting in the environmental discussion group, breakout group, and I was like, all we could do is take some of our taxes and buy these forests, right? And we could all pitch in. So it's not that easy. And even when you think of simplistic solutions, it's not that easy. So as a counselor said to me, and I relayed earlier, they don't always have the amount of funding that's needed. The prices have gone up of valued real estate. And so there has to be other ways where the people who then take possession of that land or that forest that you're trying to protect and save, they're governed by some bylaws. So you try to use bylaws and development restrictions that will make them at least save some of that forest that's on their property. So there are a lot of workarounds, looking for different kinds of funding for money, working with corporations, so that your group or the city itself doesn't have to put out the money, but it's also the responsibility of the private landowners to protect the forest.
Thank you, Sadia. Next question for you is, during your years in urban forestry, did you encounter a study that connected a certain threshold of forest canopy cover in a city to decreasing of health condition in the population, a bit like what has been seen with the Dutch elm disease and the emerald ash borer?
Right. So you're talking about the forest health, not health of humans, right? Just want to clarify. Yeah. Okay. Definitely with climate change. So we have to step back and we have to look at these other factors. There's climate change, there's policies, and then there's also development, right? That impacts the health of the forest. The research that was out there while I was doing my study did show that especially there were more prediction based under climate change, that we would see decline in health of forests. Because and there are a lot of parameters, and I'm just going to touch on a few of them. So for example, development. You have a forest that used to be 50 hectares. You reduce the edge of the forest. You're going to now lose the edge because they're taller trees. They're going to fall. So you're going to end up with an even smaller forest. So the health is going to decline. With impact from the death of insect, like from the death of trees due to insects, etc. Again, we're believing these are climate change induced insect infestations, as the ability for them to spread is and maintain their populations is due to warmer temperatures. Then you're finding that more trees are dying. You're getting more gaps in a forest, and so your soil structure and your soil characteristics are changing, and they don't sustain growth as well as they used to. So you're getting shrinking of forests. You're getting internal health factors changing due to biotic and abiotic issues. And so overall, yes, the decline of the forest is there. And the research in small different pieces that existed showed that these were what would happen, and we are seeing it happening in real time. And currently, with monitoring efforts using LiDAR, they are able to now determine much at a larger scale. Instead of having to do specific ground studies, they can go out and now determine how that's impacting. And so I can imagine there are going to be some really neat numbers coming out about how forest health is at risk. I hope I answered your question, because there's a complicated question. There's so much to answer when there's so many ways to approach it.
I agree. It seems that there are a few more questions
Sure.
need your answer, but we're running out of time. So Sadia, would that be okay? I ask you to leave your email address in the chat so
Sure.
that
I'd be
people
happy to
can
do
reach
that.
out to you if we didn't get a chance to answer their questions today.
There we go.
These are definitely
I'd be
great
glad to
questions.
discuss more or even elaborate and share some papers with you based on the health. Just a quick question. There's also research, because when I first heard the question, I was thinking you were talking about human health. There's actually research that shows that healthier urban forests and access to green spaces increases human health. And I would imagine it also increases the health of the animals that use that as their habitat, and as well as our pets. I mean, I definitely am, and even my interviewees were like, this is where we go and take our pets. We go for walks in the woodlands, and that's when they noticed what's happening by their constant interaction to be out in nature.
Thank you, Sadia, for sharing your email address and answering most of the questions.
Thank you very
Now,
much.
I would like to bring this session to a close. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar session. And once again, thank you very much to Sadia for this great presentation. Bye,
Thank you so much.
everyone.
Bye-bye.